sign-in method, this authenticate method here should probably do a little bit more than just automatically set the UID to dstruth. So let's have a look at what Firebase gives us. We're on the database tab. If we go over to authentication, it tells us we can set up a sign-in method. Let's see what that looks like. Sign-in providers. Email, password, phone, Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, anonymous. Well, I know everyone in here has a GitHub account, so let's use GitHub for authentication. If we click on that, it gives us this big form with a client ID and client secret. It says to complete setup, add this authorization callback URL to your GitHub app configuration. Okay, whatever. Let's click enable. And we know we're going to have to copy and paste this somewhere. So be sure you hit the copy button here. Don't try to drag your cursor over it yourself. Copy this callback URL because it will copy some hidden thing accidentally. Happens every time. So here's what we need to do. And if you click learn more, you can learn about this. But we need to tell GitHub about this thing. So if you just go to GitHub, click on your avatar in the upper right and go to settings. So these are your user settings, not settings for a particular project. And on the left, you'll see developer settings, OAuth applications. So Firebase is using OAuth, which is a standard for authentication, to implement all these things. So we need to tell it about it. OAuth applications. I have a bunch. Let's register a new application. I'm going to call it Note Herder S2 Afternoon. You can probably just call it Note Herder. Homepage URL is not optional, so we have to put something there. So I'm going to put my GitHub username, xtbc17s2.github.io/noteherder, because I know that would be the GitHub pages URL. It doesn't really matter. You just can't leave this blank. But if you have a real URL, if this is actually deployed somewhere, you should put the real thing there. But here's the important part. Authorization callback URL. And you can read OAuth documentation for more information, and paste that in, just like that. It should end with handler. So what this does is when our application makes a call out to GitHub saying, please log me in, when it succeeds, GitHub will then automatically forward us to this URL so that Firebase knows that we've logged in. And then Firebase can tell our app what it needs to know. Register application. Cool. Scroll up and you'll see client ID and client secret. So copy those and paste them in that form back in Firebase. Client ID, client secret. And save. And now we see GitHub is enabled. There's a section underneath our providers called authorized domains. So it won't let just anyone deploy our code, even if they have our Firebase API key. They still wouldn't be able to do authentication unless they were hosting it at one of these two domains. So if we deploy this somewhere other than localhost and Firebase itself, we're going to have to add something here. We can do that when the time comes. So back on Note Herder, let's see if we can make use of this. The Firebase docs are really good. We can't use Rebase for this. You used to be able to. But under web, getting started, manage users, password authentication, blah, blah, blah. We're going to have to do something. So let's click on GitHub here. Authenticate using GitHub with JavaScript. Okay, we already added Firebase to our project. We already registered our app. We did this stuff in the Firebase console. So now we need to handle the sign-in flow with the Firebase SDK. So it says create an instance of the GitHub provider object, which it calls firebase.auth.githubauthprovider. So let's go ahead and copy that little bit. Firebase.auth.githubauthprovider. Looks like that's a constructor, so we need the new keyword. So we're going to add this in that same base.js file where we did our other Firebase stuff. And now we need to import one more thing. We need to import Firebase/auth. We don't need to name it anything, because all this is going to do is add that auth key to the Firebase object that we already imported. So after we deal with the database, or before, it doesn't matter, we need to call this somehow. New Firebase auth GitHub auth provider. We're going to need a reference to that provider. So I'm going to make a variable called GitHub provider equals new firebase.auth.githubauthprovider. And again, firebase.auth is available because we imported Firebase auth. But you know what? Before we even do that, we also need to call app.auth. App, in this case, is our Firebase app. And we'll save that to a variable as well. Const auth equals app.auth. So I added this import up here and these two lines. But we're going to have to manage this stuff in another file. So we need to export these. We already exported the result of creating this class as our default. But we can have named exports too, right? We've certainly imported them before. So all I need to do is say export before these. And it will make them named exports because there are names here. So now we have a default export and a couple of named exports. So how do we use that? Well, we know how to import the default export, right? Just import base from base. We're already importing at least one named export somewhere. Where's that? Where in here do you see us importing a named export? It's going to be one of our import statements. Yeah, Zoe. Good guess. This one, why do I have a semicolon there? No, in this case, we're actually importing the entire file. There aren't any exports in there. We're just importing the whole thing. Yeah, Kyle. First line where it says component. So React is the default export from React. But there's a named export for component. So if we put that inside curly braces, we can import that as well. And sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. It depends on whether we're doing a real class for our component or a stateless functional component. Because on those stateless functional components, we just import React. So again, from base.js, we are exporting named exports for auth and GitHub provider. And we're going to need to use those inside our sign-in component, because this authenticate method isn't really going to do just that. Back to the React or the Firebase docs. Okay, so we need this provider. We have that. This is optional, so we'll skip it. This is optional, so we'll skip it. Authenticate with Firebase using the GitHub provider object. You can prompt your users to sign in with their GitHub accounts either by using a pop-up window or by redirecting to the sign-in page. We'll use the pop-up. So it says call sign in with pop-up. And notice what it's calling that on. Firebase.auth parentheses. And what are we exporting here? Auth parentheses. And we called it a named export auth. And we have our provider already as a named export GitHub provider. So in sign in, we could import those two things using curly braces. Auth and GitHub provider from base.js. And we want to call sign in with pop-up and pass the provider as the argument. Auth dot sign in with pop-up. And it takes a provider, such as GitHub provider. And notice this. .then, and it calls some function. So what's that .then business about? It's something that Seth alluded to a little bit in the first week. Or the second week, I don't remember when. So this is another way of doing asynchronous stuff. We've dealt with callbacks before where you just pass a function to another function and it just calls it when it's finished, like setState does that, right? If we pass a function to setState, it calls that function after setState finishes because setState is happening in the background and allows your code to keep executing. Well, sign in with pop-up takes a little bit of time, as you might imagine. So it lets our code continue executing. It happens asynchronously. But it returns something called a promise. So instead of just passing it a callback, we use a promise. And promises are a new feature in ES6. They were kind of cooked up earlier than that in some third-party libraries. But now they're actually part of built-in JavaScript. And what that does is let us call then, and then pass in what we want to happen afterward. So I'll change my indentation a little here. And then just takes a function, and it usually passes in some data. So how about we just do this and then console log whatever that data happens to look like. I'm just going to comment out this auth handler business for right now. So what this will do is call sign in with pop-up, and then only once that has finished, it'll call this function. So if I click sign in, up comes a pop-up, and GitHub is going to ask me to authorize this application. So it's a good idea to name it something sensible in your GitHub settings, because this is what users are actually going to see when they try to log in. So this wants access to my account, personal user data, email address, read only. And I'll click authorize, and notice authorizing will redirect to that thing that we passed in, the Firebase URL. Authorize dstruce. Okay, and I console.logged whatever my then function got. And it looks like it's an object with a user key. And that user key points at something with a display name of Dave Struce, an email of david@gitfrellis.com, email verified false. I don't know why it says false. And looking for a unique identifier. There we go. UID. this big nasty thing. So that's how I uniquely identify my GitHub account. So that is how our application can know about this user. Hold that thought for just a moment. Check this out over in Firebase. We're on the authentication section already. On the sign-in method tab, let's switch to the users tab. And notice, now I have a user, Dave@getfriendless.com. So I've signed into the app, and Firebase knows it. So what I consoled log was the data that got passed into my callback here, which runs after the promise completes. So it looks like data.user.uid is that UID I'm looking for. So if I were to call this auth handler business, I could just pass in data.user, and that would be an object that has a UID, and that's what auth handler expects. Auth handler was written to expect an object with a UID. Let's see what happens. Switch to my React DevTools. I see UID is null. I click sign in. It signs me in with GitHub. And UID is now this big long thing. Click sign out. And that state goes away. But we never told Firebase that we signed out. So we need to do a little something more in our sign out process. But it's really easy. And it ought to tell us this here. Blah, blah, blah. Firebase.auth parentheses .signout. Cool. So we need to import auth in app as well. So we're already importing base from base. But just like we could import React, the default, and a named export, we can do the same here. Import base, comma, curly braces, auth. And then, in our sign out method, we can call auth.signout. And I suppose it makes sense to only set the state, the UID in the state back to null if that works. So we could use then to make sure that it finishes. So we sign out. If that finishes, then we call set state. Because if Firebase didn't actually successfully log us out for some reason, we don't want to appear logged out. Just make sure we didn't break anything. Sign in. Talk to GitHub. Our state. Updated. If I hit sign out, our state goes back to null. And we know that only would have happened if sign out actually finished. So that works. So now it seems like on the Firebase level, we should make it so that you can't get to the data unless you're signed in. Since we didn't have authentication yet, we had to change that. So back on the database tab, under rules, let's change it back to the default. Instead of read and write always being true, let's set it back to auth not equal null for both. And that is a string auth not equal null. Publish those changes. And we'll see this message reappears. Default security rules require users to be authenticated. So we successfully set it back to the default rules. So now we can sign in and out. But when we sign out, although it sets UID back to null, it doesn't actually clear out the notes. So that data is still living there after we sign out, which isn't ideal. But we can deal with that later. Questions? Still a lot going on.